Hello. I hope you find this story interesting. Your feedback and suggestions as well as subscriptions are always welcome. 3 years ago, I could not even imagine that my life would change so dramatically. I was at the age when I thought that everything was already stable, that I had built my comfortable world, and now I could enjoy the fruits of my labor. 30 years of marriage to Lisa, 2 grown children, our house in the suburbs. Isn't this the perfect picture? But one morning everything changed. She left. At first I couldn't understand what was happening. Lisa has always been stable, practical, even in the smallest things. She was the one who kept our house afloat. I worked, and she organized everything else: finances, life, children. But one day, out of the blue, she just said, "I'm leaving." No warning, no explanation, no struggle. She just up and left. I was shocked not only by the fact that she left me, but also by the fact that she left behind not only an empty apartment, but also mountains of debt. All our savings were in the red: loans, mortgages, buying expensive things that never brought happiness, but only added stress. It was like an undercover battle in which I did not participate. I sat in an empty house and tried to understand why this happened, but the more I thought, the more I realized that it was hard for me to accept the truth. Everything I had built turned out to be an illusion. I was deceiving myself, believing that we were building something reliable. And now, after so many years of working together, it all just fell apart in one moment. But this is not the end of the story. I began to realize that besides my wife, someone else was behind it. It turned out that my children were involved in all this. How did this happen? How could I not see that they had betrayed me like that? My trust in them was crumbling as fast as my financial situation. My children sold our house without my knowledge. The very house in which I raised them, in which we celebrated all the important moments of life. They left me no notice, no choice. Everything was done behind my back, and all I got was a pile of debts that were now to become my burden. It was not just an emotional shock. It was a real catastrophe that seemed to threaten to drag me into a vortex of financial problems from which I could not escape. But here's the interesting thing. In the midst of this chaos, I realized one thing. I still had one advantage. I hadn't given up. I decided not to give up. And at that moment, I realized that I had to fight not only for what was lost, but also for what could still be restored. And then I received an unusual call. It was a chance, and no matter how hard it was, I knew I had to go all the way, even if the whole world seemed to be against me. My struggle began when I decided not to lose hope. Now there was only one question left. Is how to get it all back. How do I get out of this financial hole without breaking down, and maybe even find a way to win in this situation? It all started with an ordinary evening. Lisa came home from work as usual. We sat down at the table, and I immediately realized something was wrong. She was tense, silent, with a kind of expressionless look. It was unusual for her. Lisa has always been an open, sincere person. If only I had paid attention to it earlier. But I didn't. We started talking about our affairs, our children, and what we were planning for the weekend. But in her response, I heard a kind of detachment, as if she was present with her body but far away with her thoughts. At first I thought it was just stress from work. Recently I had a lot of tasks, long deadlines, and additional workload. But the next day the situation only got worse. We sat down to dinner, and I noticed that she wasn't eating at all. She was just sipping coffee and looking out the window. Of course, I asked her if she was okay, but she said that everything was fine. That was the moment when I believed the lie, even though her facial expression said otherwise. I started looking for the reason in myself. Maybe I had become less interesting. Maybe it's because I worked so much. Was I focused only on finance and business and neglected everything else? But the real betrayal was right in front of me, and I couldn't see it. A few days later, Lisa left. She simply said that she needed to think about it, that she didn't feel happy that we were estranged. This, of course, sounded like a lie. I felt that she had been in something more than just unhappy for a long time. Something was irreparable, and I couldn't figure out what it was. It's not that I didn't try to do something. I tried to be affectionate, attentive, even asked her what was going on. She would silently shake her head and say, "It's not about me." And no matter how hard I tried to get something out of her, she remained closed like a locked safe. But the real shock was yet to come. One day I went into her office and noticed that her laptop was open to a social media page. And then I saw him. A person she had known for a long time, but I had even paid attention to him. I was so engrossed in my work that I hardly noticed what was going on in her life. And here's the result. There was a correspondence on the screen, not just friendly, but from another world. It turned out that she had been dating him for over a month. She didn't just forget about me. She was living her illusions elsewhere, in her own little world, which I didn't even notice. She was trying to keep everything under control, even when she had stopped loving me a long time ago. I ran to her, trying to understand how this could have happened. We started talking, and I, of course, tried to understand her logic. Why? How? What made her do it? She started making excuses, saying that it was all for the sake of emotional recovery, that I was too busy with my work. But that was not an explanation. It wasn't even an excuse. I had to pick up the broken pieces of this life. Everything felt vulnerable and empty. My wife had gone beyond a point that I could not understand, and which had probably become a habit for her. Now she came back with something I couldn't believe, and it became clear that she wasn't looking for an apology. I didn't understand how this had happened. It was more than just a betrayal. It was an internal destruction of what I thought was stable and reliable. It was a deception that slowly swallowed everything around me. What had I done wrong? What could have been the trigger for this change? Interestingly, I never had any suspicions, not even the slightest hint of such behavior. No one around us had any idea. Everyone thought we were a perfect couple, that we were happy. But it turns out that under this mask, there was something completely different. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a process of losing myself, not only on her part, but also on mine. After that, I asked myself an important question: what to do now? How do I regain control? How do I avoid this becoming a constant nightmare that I can't forget? And this is where the real struggle began. The struggle not only to restore my trust, but also to restore my finances, to avoid falling into the same cycle of horrific destruction. How can you win this fight for your own happiness? It was a difficult but very important question. When I found out that my children had sold my house, I felt as if the ground had slipped from under my feet. It was my last hope, my refuge, my connection to the past. I had spent my whole life building this place so that my children could grow up here and have their own safe harbor. Now, without any warning, they have stripped me of that. This house was a symbol of everything I had achieved. I remember how my wife and I, at the beginning of our married life, dug a vegetable garden, painted the walls, and dreamed of our future. Consequences, though we were able to make this place special with our joint efforts, with each generation that grew up here. Children ran around the yard, laughed in the garden, we celebrated holidays together, and all this became part of the history of this house. But today, all of this has become just material property that could be sold, without taking into account either my feelings or the memories that I have kept all my life. How did this happen? How did I end up on the street without a roof over my head? It all started when my daughter Katie, who had been married for a long time and had a family of her own, began to lose interest in her home. She often said that we needed to make room for new opportunities. Her husband, Ryan, seemed very interested in selling the house quickly, although he didn't express it so openly. But the more I understood, the more it became apparent that they wanted to sell the house to get more money. I remember one evening when I came home after a hard day, Kathy and Ryan were sitting in the kitchen looking a little nervous. They couldn't look me in the eye. At first I didn't realize what was going on until Katie said, "Dad, we've decided to sell the house. It's the right thing for all of us." That was my big mistake. I didn't pay attention to the way they were discussing it in a tone that indicated that the decision had already been made. I tried to talk to them, to remind them how much this house meant to us, how much it meant to me, but they were more stubborn than ever. With every word they said, I realized that they had done this without my permission, without any discussion with me. They just decided that selling the house was the best option. All my questions remained unanswered, and my arguments that I could no longer be without a roof over my head had no effect. My daughter Katie, who had always been close to me, became cold and distant. She wouldn't even look me in the eye. Ryan just looked away, as if he was afraid to talk to me. That was the moment when I realized that my children no longer wanted to have anything to do with me. My wife, who had long since left this world, could not even imagine that this could happen to our family. How could I have allowed myself to be in this situation? How could I not see that their wishes and plans were changing and I had lost everything? How could I allow money to become such a powerful motive for them that they could ruthlessly deprive me of my only home? It was not just the sale of a house. It was more than a material loss. It was a betrayal, a big and bitter one. By selling the house, they received a significant amount of money, and I could not resist when I learned that most of this money went to their personal needs, to buy new cars, to travel. It had hurt me to see them spending this money for their own pleasure, while I was left with nothing, no roof over my head, no place where I could leave my soul in peace. I tried to leave everything in the past, tried to move on, but I couldn't. As soon as I realized that my children were not like that anymore, I started looking for other ways to regain some control over my life. I found support from my friends, from those who have always been there for me. They helped me find a new path. Not having a home did not mean the end for me. I returned to my roots and started building a new life, a new hope. And although it was hard, I realized that the main thing is not what was taken away from me, but what I can still give myself. I found the strength to start again. But the question remained, why did my children sell my house? And what was next? Will I be able to forgive them for this betrayal? Will I ever be able to understand their choice? My children sold my house, and I was left on the street. I felt betrayed, forgotten, abandoned. However, this was only the beginning. The whole situation seems to have been just a test of my resilience, so that I could understand who my enemy really was. And as it turned out, he was not where I expected. For many years I believed that my children were something I was proud of. I raised them with the best of intentions, poured my heart and soul into their upbringing, and thought I would always be an example to them. Perhaps that's why their act came as such a shock to me. But over time I began to realize that the real enemy, the one who ruined my life, was not in my family. At first I tried to look for answers in my children to accuse them of betrayal. I couldn't understand how they could do this to me, how they could do it without a second thought. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to notice little things that didn't add up. Why now? Why did they sell the house when I couldn't do anything about it? I was like that helpless old man, unable to intervene. Why were my daughter Kathy and her husband Ryan so stubborn about this? It was not a simple transaction for them. They were strikingly cold when we discussed the matter, something about their behavior seemed so artificial that I began to suspect there was another force driving them. I decided to dig deeper, to try to find the key to this mystery. It wasn't just a story about my house. It was a story about money, about power, about lost illusions. But who was behind all these events? Who is pulling the strings behind the scenes? My investigation began with small signs that I hadn't noticed before. I started paying attention to every move Katie and Ryan made, their phone calls, who they met with. I accidentally found out that they often met with a businessman, Jeff. At first I didn't understand why this was important, but then as I found more information about his business, I began to understand. Jeff was one of those people who could improve a family's financial situation, but also destroy it. He was an entrepreneur with a dark reputation, working with fraudulent schemes, cheating people into bankruptcy. But he was also associated with huge business opportunities. He was the type of person who goes for the goal, regardless of anyone or anything. And this man was a part of my children's lives. My heart became heavy. Was this exactly what I had been trying not to see for so long? Was Jeff the one who was driving this story? I began to realize that the real enemy was not my children. They were just tools, puppets in the hands of this man. And this is painful because I had high hopes for them. I started looking for ways to turn the situation around. There was no limit to my anger. I couldn't just let things go. This Jeff would not leave my children alone. He was using them as part of a big game, not thinking that they were my blood, my children, whom I loved and raised. How did it happen that he became more important to them than me? To do this, I needed to seek support from those who could give me information and resources. I reached out to a few friends with whom I had once worked together and began to gather everything I could about Jeff and his schemes. He was not just a businessman, but a man who had no principles and was willing to do anything for his own benefit. As soon as I realized what was behind the story, I felt that there was a chance to make things right. But to do so, I had to face the enemy directly. I had to figure out how to get my kids back, and if I could change their lives before they were completely trapped in Jeff's trap. My goal was now clear, not just to get my house back, but to get my children back. To understand why I had drifted away from me, and why they had agreed to become part of this dirty world, where money solves everything. After my children sold my house, I found myself in a situation where all my efforts were in vain. My attempts to save what was left and my hopes for their understanding had crashed against a wall of indifference. And now I stood on the threshold of another terrible reality. Debts. Disappointing, huge debts that slowly but inexorably began to consume me. I did not understand how it happened. I used to live a normal life, had my own business, a stable income. But everything changed in one short moment. By selling the house, my children not only deprived me of a roof over my head, but also left me with debts that were simply becoming unbearable. They handed over everything they could to the creditors, my personal savings, my business, even the furniture I had collected all my life. I never thought I would be in this situation. If someone had told me this story a few years ago, I would not have believed it. Moreover, I have always tried to keep my finances under control. How did I end up in such debt? How did everything happen so fast? The source of my problems was the same Jeff, a businessman whom I now considered my enemy. I had already realized that he had not only manipulated my children, but had also become part of this financial trap. My children sold the house not only for the money, but also because they were involved in a scheme that this Jeff had set up. He was involved in every step of the way, and what's more, he had plans that I couldn't foresee. What's worse, he had influence. He was in every business circle, in every financial deal. My children could not understand that they had become part of this world where no moral principles mattered, and they paid a very high price for their trust in Jeff. And that price was enormous. My debts began to mount. Every day, every call, every letter from the mail was like a punch in the face, and I felt like my life was falling apart right before my eyes. All these loans, fines, urgent payments it was impossible to overcome. And worst of all, I was trapped. And then the main question arose, how could I get out of this hopeless circle? I started thinking about everything that had happened, and each time I realized that I only had myself to blame. I was not prepared for what was happening. I had no plan. I thought that everything would be fine, that everything would work out, but everything just got worse. If I had been smarter, I would have found a way out earlier. I knew I should have paid attention to the warnings, but I didn't pay attention to them, and now I am trapped in the prison of my own debts with no way out. Every day the situation was getting worse. A&A creditors were calling, making new demands. They didn't give me a single chance for a reprieve. I could no longer leave it alone. Every day was like a struggle for survival. But I decided not to give up. I could not leave it all behind. I decided that I would look for ways to get out of this situation. It was not easy, but I realized that I had no right to give up. I couldn't let these debts consume my life completely. I started looking for options. And the first step I took was to contact financial advisors. Maybe they could help me get out of this desperate situation. I also started reviewing all my agreements and documents to see where I had made mistakes. And, most importantly, I was looking for new ways to make money. But all this was difficult. It was hard to accept that I, a person who had worked hard all my life, was now in a debt trap. I felt my pride start to crack. Everything I had achieved was crumbling before my eyes. But I promised myself that I would find a way. I would not sit and wait for my life to take this debt away from me. There was no limit to my determination. This was not just a financial crisis. It was a fight for my future. I couldn't let my life and my existence end because of a few insidious machinations. I had to find a way to win, and I was ready to do anything to do it. And this day began like any other. Like all the previous ones. I woke up early. It usually seemed that life would not change, and I got used to a routine existence. But inside, everything was different. From time to time, I tried to find at least something positive in my thoughts. But what do you do when your efforts fail? When you fall into a trap of your own making again and again? All these debts, all these promises that I couldn't fulfill. Disappointment was slowly consuming me. My attempts to bring everything back to normal looked less and less realistic. I did everything I could to fix the situation. I went to counselors, tried to find new ways to earn money, but nothing helped. And my financial problems were only getting worse, and the feeling of powerlessness was enveloping me more and more. Why couldn't I have prevented this? How could I not have seen it coming before this moment? And it seemed like my whole life was a big, painful mistake. I felt that I had disappointed not only myself, but also the people who had once trusted me. I couldn't look my children in the eye anymore. I was supposed to protect them from such mistakes, not drag them into this financial direction of no return. But even in the darkest moments, when I had almost lost all hope, I realized that I could not give up completely. After all, I still had my life to live. And if I gave up, I wouldn't have that either. There was no choice. That day was one of the hardest days of my life. All my actions seemed to be in vain. And I tried to analyze my financial strategies, but they looked more and more like a trap I had set for myself. And then I had an idea that had been nagging at me. It turns out that I simply didn't see all the possibilities. I limited myself in my thoughts, focusing only on how everything was lost. But in reality, I hadn't seen all the options yet. I started to think not only about what I had lost, but also about what I could gain in the future. It was a small spark of hope, and I held on to it. The disappointment began to recede, and gradually, step by step, I began to realize that there was a way out. I still don't know how, but it was the only thing that kept me afloat. Then I started to dive deeper into my financial issues. I reviewed my savings, looked for investment opportunities and new sources of income. I began to use all the knowledge I had accumulated over the years that had seemed so useless before, and slowly but surely I found my way. It was a difficult path, but it led to something important. All these actions did not give an instant result, but with each step I felt that I was getting closer to something new. I found new opportunities for work. I met people who could help me and opened new horizons for me. It seemed that the world was changing, and my situation began to change along with it. But then I realized one important rule: the paths to success are not always straight. Sometimes they look confusing, even hopeless. And in these confusing situations, you can come up with new solutions that you could not have imagined before. You just have to keep at it. Now I realize that disappointment is just a temporary state. It's part of the journey. But after it always comes hope if you are open to change. I decided that I would not give up on myself anymore. I have already experienced the worst. From now on, I can only go forward. With each new step, I felt my strength returning. Although I was still far from completely solving my financial problems, I knew I could fight. All I could do was to keep going, gradually pulling myself out of this crisis. My hope began to become more stable, and I realized that everything I had learned over the years was not in vain. And although new challenges appeared again, I was no longer afraid. Disappointment receded, and a new strength gradually took its place, a strength that arises when you are able to accept reality and find opportunities for change in it. Each of us has faced moments in our lives when everything seemed to be going wrong. When the feeling of hopelessness literally consumes you, and it seems that nothing will change until you take some incredible step. That was the moment for me. The moment when I finally realized that everything I wanted was actually just the beginning of something much bigger. It seemed that I had already lost everything: my home, my money, my family. But, strangely enough, the biggest challenge was yet to come. And so in this chaos I made one incredible discovery that seemed to change everything. And I really couldn't believe it had happened. It didn't happen at the moment when I was about to start my old business again, when I was trying to pay off all my debts. No, it happened when I realized that nothing changes until I change myself. No strategy, no plan will save me if I remain the same person I was before. Everything I was doing seemed to be an endless cycle, where debts were increasing and opportunities to get myself out of the crisis were becoming fewer and fewer. But that's when I realized one simple thing. All this was my choice. And I had to change something radically, something in myself. I couldn't keep acting out of habit, hoping that everything would suddenly be resolved. I knew it was like waiting for the sky to clear by itself during a thunderstorm. I had to become the one who could bring myself to change. And, this discovery was not instantaneous. I didn't discover a single solution that would change everything. No, I started to see more opportunities around me. My eyes were open to things I hadn't noticed before. Every moment, every new day gave me more insight into what was really going on. The first discovery was that my situation was not a disaster that could not be fixed. It was just a series of choices made at the wrong time and in the wrong direction. And now that I started to see how everything is interconnected, I realized that even the worst moments can be overcome. All these stresses, debts, and failures, it turns out, were not the end. They were just signposts that led me to the realization that I could start all over again. The second important discovery was the realization that there are people around me who are ready to help. I used to try to keep everything inside me, to fight alone, thinking that I was alone in this world. But it turned out that the real strength is in the community, in finding support from others, learning from them. I found a few people with whom I began to cooperate, and they opened up new opportunities for me. They showed me that even in the most difficult situations, you can find ways to develop. And one more thing, it was my own inner realization. I used to be afraid of change, afraid of the unknown. I was afraid that I would stay in the same place at any cost, even if it gave me nothing but pain. But it turned out that changes are not scary if you know that every new day is a chance for a new life, that you can do it, and that you are not bound by what happened yesterday. I began to realize that everything that was happening was part of a bigger plan. I hadn't seen all the details yet, but these discoveries gave me strength. And it was at the moment when I realized that I had to change my mind and my attitude towards the world that I saw the first positive changes. What I found was not instantaneous, not immediately obvious. But it was this small discovery that became the key that allowed me to open new doors. And with each step I took, I felt my life begin to turn around. I no longer perceived problems as barriers that could not be overcome. And I started asking myself, what can I do next to change the situation? And this became my engine. I used to look for answers in the outside world. Now I realized that all I needed was a change within myself. And it was this discovery that ultimately changed everything. Life is a constant struggle. The struggle for a better future, the struggle for your own well-being, the struggle to keep everything from going wrong. But when everything is falling apart, when you are overwhelmed by despair, when it seems that there is no power to change the situation, it is at this moment that an opportunity opens up for you. And that's when you realize that there is one plan that can change everything. My plan was not complicated, but it was terribly difficult. After all, changing your life is not just about deciding to do something. It is something much more. It's a transition through something you've always avoided. And this moment, this turning point, was the chance I had been looking for all my life. At first, the plan seemed simple to me: let go of everything that was holding me back. All these debts, all these problems, these terrible thoughts that everything was already lost. Letting go means starting over, looking at everything from a different angle. But at first it was scary. I was tied to my old way of life. I was holding on to the thought that I would never be able to start again. I was afraid to take the first step because I thought it might be the last. And that was my biggest mistake. But I realized one important thing. You can't change anything until you're ready to let go of everything that's preventing you from moving forward. Most of us hide in the past, believing that it will give us a sense of stability. But in reality, these are just chains that prevent us from moving forward. You cannot achieve something new if you are constantly looking back. So the first step of my plan was to free myself from this burden of the past. The second step of the plan was perhaps the most difficult. I forced myself to take an honest look at my fears. Fears are not something we can just ignore. They penetrate your soul and leave dark spots there. And it is because of them that you cannot move forward. Fear not only stops you, it destroys you from the inside. And I realized that the only way to conquer fears is to face them. I began to analyze each of my fears: the fear of losing everything, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of the unknown. When I looked at them without fear, they began to shrink. Asking myself what I was most afraid of, I began to look for what it was about these fears that kept me in place. It was an incredible process, because you not only free yourself from external pressure, but also change your internal attitude. I learned to accept mistakes as part of the process. Every failed step became an opportunity for learning. And that was important. I stopped being afraid to make mistakes. The third stage of the plan is the action strategy. After I got rid of my fears and freed myself from heavy thoughts, I realized that it was time to start acting. Without concrete steps and a plan, this new consciousness would not make sense. I started planning my actions like I had never done before. I divided all my plans into small steps. With a clear path, I was able to focus on taking at least one small step toward my goal every day. But most importantly, I started listening to myself. Do you ever remember a time when you didn't have enough time to just listen to what you really needed? I realized that my inner desires had become my greatest guide. I started acting on them, and if I felt that it was best to stop and rest, I did so. And if I felt it was time to act, I did so without hesitation. My plan became so simple that it had only one condition: to live in harmony with myself. And the last step, the last key to the success of my plan, was patience. Changes do not happen overnight. I realize that nothing happens instantly, but it is important to keep going. And sometimes you take steps back, and sometimes it seems like you haven't made any progress. But if you don't stop and keep moving forward, you will definitely see results. My plan was not perfect, but it was real. It allowed me to regain control of my life and showed me that anything is possible if you are willing to work for yourself. I thought everything was out of control, but when I finally opened my eyes to what was happening, I realized that it was all planned. Everything I had experienced, the debts, the betrayal, the destruction of my life, was not an accident. It was a well-planned maneuver, but who was behind it all? When my house was sold, when I was left homeless, I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt betrayed and abandoned. Was it a big mistake? Maybe I hadn't seen something. The money that I was owed seemed to have disappeared, as if it had never been there. I went to the bank, tried to find out who was in charge of these processes, but everything looked like a bizarre trap. It wasn't just unfortunate circumstances. I really began to realize that someone was manipulating this situation. And here the question arises: who? Who was so careful and carefully thought out every step to put me in such a trap? The answer surprised me more than any other twist in the story. It was a person I called a friend, the one who was always there for me, always assuring me that everything would be okay, and that he would help me when I needed it. How could I not see that? My old friend Michael. We've known each other for years. He used to be just one of those people with whom you had coffee and talked about life. He was a part of my environment, And he was the one not only helped my wife organize the sale of the house, but also benefited from this situation more than anyone else. Did I ever realize that he was manipulating me so cunningly? I can't say that it came as a complete surprise to me, but the bitterness I felt when I learned the truth was unforgettable. What was most impressive was the way he made me believe everything that was happening. He was a skillful manipulator, subtly creating an atmosphere of support and trust, while in reality he was just waiting for the moment to take advantage of my situation. He promised to help me with all my problems, from debts to financial difficulties. He said that I just needed to be patient, that everything would work out, And I trusted him because I believed he meant well. But everything was part of his plan. The very debts that he helped me solve were actually the result of his manipulations. He was deliberately steering my finances towards collapse so that I would need his help later. And when he saw that the situation had gone too far, and I was almost on my knees, that's when he made his decision. Selling the house was just the final chord. I couldn't believe it, but there was no doubt he was the one behind all my misfortunes. I couldn't let it all go unpunished, so I decided to act. I was not going to sit back and wait for him to continue his game. He promised to help, but in reality he had other plans. Despite all my doubts, I felt that I had a chance to regain control of the situation. Only now I knew exactly who my real enemy was. And there was nothing that could stop me. Everything I had achieved now mattered for one purpose only: to stop Michael. My plan was beginning to unfold, and I began to realize that there were other possibilities that I hadn't noticed before. With everything planned, I went to the place where Michael spent most of his time. He was not expecting me there. And that was enough to start a game he wasn't ready to play. Preparation was an important part of my plan. This was not a spontaneous revenge. This was my chance to change the rules of the game, my chance to get back what was stolen. I felt that my next move would decide everything. Sometimes life puts us in front of a choice that changes everything. The choice between despair and struggle, between giving up or finding a way to go on. No matter what. For me, it was the very moment when I realized that I couldn't just give up. Not after everything that happened. Not after all the losses and pain. And I sat in the silence of my empty apartment for a long time, trying to figure out what to do next. My finances were on the verge of collapse, my debts were consuming me, and Michael, my old friend, the one I once considered a brother, had abandoned me, leaving me without protection and only a shadow of what had once been my life. The betrayal was so deep that I could not believe how it happened. But I realized that if I didn't find a way to win, my life would end like this with nothing. But wasn't I a fool to believe him? When all this happened, I felt that something was wrong, but I didn't want to see the obvious. He was a master of manipulation, and his ability to play on my emotions became my biggest enemy. He knew how to create the illusion of support when in fact he had his own plans. Now there was only one chance left. I realized this chance when I went to the bank. I felt that there was another way out of this situation, but how? How could I reverse everything when every step was tangled with thousands of small details? I started looking for new options. If Michael had been so careful to think through every step, then I had an advantage after all. My advantage was that he had underestimated me. I was no longer someone who fed on naivety. I started to study all the agreements, all the documents he gave me. And just when I was on the verge of despair, I noticed a detail that I hadn't been able to see before. A small signature on one of the papers was his signature. He had left it there by accident. A small mistake, but it was my key to victory. It turned out that Michael was trying to convince me to sign a contract that would effectively deprive me of my last chance to keep at least something. But it was a document that had no legal force without my signature. Then, I realized that Michael thought I would not be able to get up, that I was already tired and broken. And that's where he was wrong. And I couldn't let him have everything I loved and more. My sense of justice woke up again, and I decided to act. I contacted a lawyer who used to help me with small cases. And he turned out to be the one who broke Michael's game. Together we discovered that his manipulations and the signed documents were beyond question. According to the law, the deal was illegal, and most of his actions could be interpreted as fraud. But this was not the final victory. As soon as I found out that Michael and his partners were going to be in the dock, I realized that I had to act quickly. So I headed to the city, to the place where he and his team did most of their business. I had no time to hesitate. The plan was simple. I had to present new documents and accusations to finally destroy his career and restore my life. And all of this became possible when I realized that the key to victory is not always in great power or even money. Sometimes all you need is focus, patience, and determination. Michael did not expect me to find a way out of this situation. He was confident that his plan would work out as planned. When I arrived at his office, he realized he was wrong. We looked into each other's eyes, and I could see his face change. He realized he couldn't take it back. I had won, but this moment of victory did not bring me joy. I didn't care how much I gained from his loss. I didn't care how much money I could have made or how much I could have lost. It was not my victory because of money. It was a victory of the spirit. I realized that actually fighting for my life, for my dignity, is the most important thing. And although financial stability and getting back everything I had lost were important, I was left with one question that has plagued me ever since: how many people like me fall into similar traps and never have a chance to come back? Or how many are at the very bottom and they need just one moment to realize that they can win? My victory is not just the return of material things, it is a change in my outlook. I found strength where I didn't expect it and realized that life gives you chances. And even when it seems that everything is lost, there is always a way back.